In late 1968, an NVA truck convoy commander named Hyen heard the same low circling engine sound his drivers had learned to fear months earlier. He realized within seconds that something about it had changed. He knew the old sound well. Every driver on his stretch of the Ho Chi Minh Trail knew it. A single distinctive engine note that meant a lumbering twin-tailed cargo plane was somewhere overhead, converted into a gun platform that could pour fire onto a fixed point for as long as its fuel and ammunition lasted. His drivers had learned to recognize that sound early enough to scatter, to kill their lights, and find cover before the first burst of fire ever found them. It was a real and serious threat, but it was a known one, and known threats could be planned around. What Hyen heard that night was not quite the same sound. It carried an added, higher note underneath the familiar drone, something that did not belong to the aircraft his drivers had spent a year learning to evade. He did not yet know what had changed. He knew only that the convoy under his command needed to move now immediately, based on nothing more than an unfamiliar undertone in an engine note he thought he had already learned to survive. He was right to be afraid. The aircraft circling above his convoy that night was not the one his men had trained against. It was heavier, faster, carrying weapons the older aircraft had never mounted, and it would finish that night's work in a fraction of the time its predecessor would have needed. Hyen could not know the designation of the aircraft that had just changed the sound of the sky above his trail, or that American engineers had spent 2 years deliberately solving every weakness his side had learned to exploit in the older gunship. He knew only that the old rules learned at real cost over a year of nighttime convoys no longer applied, and that the machine responsible for that change was, in every way that mattered to a man moving trucks under fire, worse than the one it had replaced. That is the story of Puff's successor, and the arithmetic that made it even more dangerous. Now, let me show you exactly what had changed. If a story like this matters to you, if the men who lived it on both sides deserve to be remembered, a like and a subscribe help it reach the people who care. It takes 1 second. These are the stories the history books leave out. Now, to understand why this new aircraft frightened men who had already learned to survive its predecessor, you first have to understand exactly what was wrong with the older gunship and why the Air Force felt real, mounting pressure to replace it. To understand why this new aircraft mattered so much, you have to understand the specific and genuine limitations of the gunship that came before it. Because the older aircraft, effective as it had been, was never built for the scale of demand the war eventually placed on it. The original fixed-wing gunship concept, built around a converted World War II-era cargo plane, had proven the basic idea brilliant. Mount multiple weapons along one side of a slow, circling aircraft, and that aircraft becomes capable of pouring sustained, accurate fire onto a single point on the ground for as long as it can stay airborne. This idea worked, and it worked well enough that demand for exactly this capability grew far faster than the aging airframe underneath it could reasonably support. The original aircraft was, by the standards of a war that increasingly demanded gunships work farther from base, loiter longer, and carry heavier weapons, simply not powerful enough for the job being asked of it. Single engine, decades old, limited in both speed and the weight of weaponry it could realistically carry, it represented a brilliant solution running up hard against its own physical limits. Picture what this actually meant for a squadron trying to keep up with demand for exactly this capability across an entire war zone. Requests for gunship support arriving faster than a single-engine, aging airframe could realistically answer. Aircraft flying beyond reasonable maintenance intervals simply because no replacement was available to take their place. Crews stretching an already limited design past what its original engineers had ever intended, because the alternative was leaving ground troops without the support they urgently needed. By late 1967, the demand for this kind of aircraft had outpaced what a single gunship program could reasonably supply. A newer, larger, and considerably more sophisticated gunship was already in development, built on a much larger transport airframe, but that newer aircraft's own airframe was too valuable elsewhere in the war effort to convert in the numbers actually needed, and its own transport role made every conversion a real trade-off against cargo capacity the broader war still required. The Air Force needed something in between, more capable than the original aging gunship, but built from an airframe available in the quantities the war actually demanded. The answer came from an aircraft already sitting in inventory, underused and available in real numbers, converted specifically to close the gap between what the original gunship could do and what the newer, more sophisticated aircraft could not yet supply in sufficient quantity. This was not a glamorous or headline-grabbing solution. It was a pragmatic one, built from spare capacity rather than any dramatic new design, and that pragmatism is exactly why it existed at all. Now understand, specifically and mechanically, exactly what made this new gunship a genuine escalation rather than a simple cosmetic replacement, because the changes were real, substantial, and directly responsible for the different sound Hyen heard that night. The new aircraft carried twin engines rather than the single engine of its predecessor, immediately solving one of the older aircraft's most serious limitations: vulnerability to any single engine failure, and a hard ceiling on how much weight and fuel, armor, and weaponry one engine could reasonably lift and sustain over hours of loitering flight. Two engines meant genuine redundancy, a real safety margin the older aircraft had simply never possessed, and it meant a heavier, more capable aircraft could stay airborne for longer, carrying more of everything that actually mattered in a sustained gunship engagement. The weapons load reflected this new capacity directly. Where the original gunship had carried a handful of machine guns, this new aircraft mounted 4 rapid-firing, multi-barreled miniguns along its side, a substantial increase in sustained firepower over its predecessor, each one capable of putting rounds on target at a rate the older gunship's weapons could not approach. A specialized variant of this new aircraft went further still, adding 2 20mm automatic cannons to the standard 4 minigun armament, weapons with genuinely greater range and considerably more destructive power per round than the rifle-caliber miniguns alone could deliver, specifically intended to give crews a weapon capable of reliably destroying trucks and hardened targets rather than simply suppressing exposed personnel. Picture the actual physical scale of that added firepower standing beneath the aircraft on the ground before a mission. 4 minigun barrels bristling from the fuselage, each one capable of a sustained rate of fire the older gunship's weapons could not match. On the specialized variant, 2 more barrels beside them, thicker, built for a heavier round entirely, weapons a ground crew loaded and serviced with visibly more care than the lighter guns beside them, because everyone handling that ammunition understood exactly what it was built to do to a vehicle. And that same specialized variant carried something the original gunship program had never possessed at all: auxiliary jet engines mounted under the wings alongside the standard piston engines, providing a genuine boost in power and performance precisely when a heavily loaded gunship needed it most, during takeoff and at altitude over a target. This is very likely the added note Hyen heard that night. An underlying jet whine layered beneath the familiar radial engine drone his drivers had spent a year learning to recognize. The specific physical signature of an aircraft his side had never encountered before, doing a job the older gunship simply could not do as completely. Together, These changes did not represent a minor refinement of an existing idea. They represented a genuine escalation in every dimension that mattered to a convoy commander like Hyen: more firepower, longer loiter time, greater survivability for the crew, and in the specialized truck hunting variant, weapons specifically built to solve the exact problem his convoys represented. Understanding why Hyen specifically, as a man responsible for moving trucks rather than defending a fixed position, feared this new aircraft more than its predecessor requires understanding the specific mission one variant of it was purpose-built to perform, while the standard version of this new gunship continued the close support role its predecessor had always performed, defending fixed positions and supporting ground troops in contact. A dedicated variant was developed and deployed specifically to hunt trucks moving along the extensive supply network running through Laos and Cambodia into South Vietnam. This was, by design, a different mission from anything the original gunship had been optimized for. It demanded an aircraft capable of loitering for extended periods over routes where trucks were suspected or confirmed to be moving, carrying sensors and weapons specifically suited to finding and destroying vehicles rather than simply suppressing exposed troops in the open. The addition of the 20mm cannons mattered enormously for exactly this mission. A truck, unlike an exposed soldier, presented a hardened target that rifle-caliber fire alone could damage but not always reliably destroy, and a crew hunting trucks needed a weapon with genuine stopping power against vehicles rather than simply a high volume of lighter caliber fire. The addition of auxiliary jet power mattered just as directly, giving this variant the performance margin needed to operate effectively at the altitudes and loiter times the truck hunting mission actually demanded, over terrain and air defenses considerably more dangerous than the close support missions its predecessor had typically flown. Picture a single engagement in this new role because it clarifies the difference between suppressing a position and hunting a specific hardened target. A convoy spotted moving along a stretch of trail, its trucks briefly exposed on open road. The crew above does not simply hose the general area with suppressive fire the way the older gunship might have against a tree line. They select individual vehicles, bring the heavier cannons to bear, and destroy trucks specifically one at a time, with a precision and a lethality against hardened targets that the lighter, older weapon system was never built to achieve. For a man like Hyen, this meant the threat above his convoy was no longer simply a powerful weapon platform in the general sense the original gunship had represented. It was, in this specialized variant, an aircraft engineered from the outset to solve the specific problem his job represented: moving supplies along contested routes at night in vehicles that a general-purpose weapon might damage, but that this purpose-built variant was specifically equipped to destroy outright. The threat had not simply grown larger, it had become specifically, deliberately tailored to the exact vulnerability his entire mission depended on. It would be incomplete to present this new aircraft as a simple, unqualified improvement over its predecessor in every respect, because the honest history includes real limitations and real costs that came with this escalation. The larger, heavier airframe, for all its added capability, remained a slow, propeller-driven aircraft operating at altitudes within range of increasingly capable ground fire, and North Vietnamese and Allied forces adapted their own air defenses over the same years this aircraft was proving its value. The aircraft's own operational history includes real losses to enemy fire over the course of the war, a genuine and ongoing cost paid by the crews who flew it, and the aircraft's vulnerability to concentrated anti-aircraft fire meant its use had to be carefully weighed against the air defense density of any given target area, Particularly along the more heavily defended stretches of the trail network, the truck hunting variant was specifically built to patrol. The aircraft was also fundamentally an adaptation of an existing transport design rather than a purpose-built combat aircraft, and that heritage carried real limitations no amount of added engines and weapons could fully erase. It remained slower and less maneuverable than a dedicated attack aircraft, dependent on the same basic vulnerability every side-firing gunship shared. Effectiveness that depended on maintaining a stable, predictable orbit over a target, a requirement that made the aircraft, whatever its added firepower, still fundamentally reliant on operating in airspace the enemy had at least some ability to contest. And it is worth being honest that this aircraft, however genuine an improvement over its predecessor, was itself already something of a stopgap, a pragmatic solution built to bridge a gap in available capability rather than a permanent final answer to the gunship mission. The more sophisticated aircraft already in development would eventually take over the most demanding missions this aircraft had been filling, and production of new units for this design ended relatively quickly once the more capable Successor became available in sufficient numbers. This aircraft's service life, however consequential during the years it flew, was always understood, even by the men who built and flew it, as an intermediate solution rather than a lasting one. It would be dishonest to end this story with North Vietnamese convoy operations simply absorbing this new threat passively, because Hyen's side adapted to this escalation the same way it had adapted to every prior American advance in that long war, with real, practical countermeasures built from hard experience. Convoy commanders learned over the months following this aircraft's introduction to identify its distinct engine signature specifically, distinguishing it from its predecessor's more familiar sound and adjusting their own procedures accordingly. Drivers were trained to recognize the added jet undertone this new variant carried, treating any convoy that heard it as facing a more capable and more dangerous threat than the one their earlier training had prepared them for, and adjusting their dispersal and concealment procedures to reflect that heightened danger. Picture the specific training this adaptation actually required, passed from experienced drivers to newer ones the same way survival knowledge always traveled on that trail. A veteran driver describing the exact pitch of the added engine note, having his younger counterparts listen to recordings or descriptions until they could distinguish it reliably from the older, more familiar threat. This was not casual advice. It was treated as seriously as any other survival skill on a road where a wrong guess about which aircraft was overhead could cost an entire convoy. Anti-aircraft defenses along the most heavily traveled and most valuable stretches of the trail network grew more concentrated and more sophisticated over the same years this aircraft operated, a direct response to the increased danger aircraft like this one represented to convoy operations that the broader war effort could not afford to lose. This escalation in air defense capability is precisely what eventually forced changes in how gunships of every generation operated over the most contested sections of the trail, requiring more careful route selection, more coordination with suppression missions, and a growing acceptance that the safest stretches of trail from the earlier years of the war were no longer nearly as safe by its later years. This honest accounting matters because it keeps the story from reading as one-sided American technological escalation meeting a static, unchanging opponent. Hyen's side absorbed a genuine and painful escalation in the threat this new aircraft represented, and it responded, over time, with real institutional learning and real costly adaptation. The same patient, resource-conscious approach to a persistent problem this series has described in nearly every context where North Vietnamese forces faced a materially superior adversary. Hyen survived the war, and in the years afterward, he thought often about that night the sound above his convoy had changed, and about what it had actually taught him regarding the nature of the war he had spent years fighting. He came to understand with time that the escalation he experienced that night was not an isolated event, but part of a continuous pattern that had shaped nearly every aspect of the war he had fought. Every advantage his side found, every weakness it learned to exploit in American equipment and tactics, was met sooner or later with a deliberate, engineered response, built by an industrial and technical base capable of identifying a specific problem and solving it methodically, aircraft by aircraft, variant by variant, over years of sustained development. This was not, he came to believe, a story about a single frightening new weapon. It was a story about an opponent whose entire approach to the war involved this kind of continuous, iterative improvement, applied relentlessly to every problem his own side's resistance managed to create. He thought, too, about what this meant for the specific, hard-won knowledge he had built over a year of moving convoys safely past the older gunship's threat. That knowledge had not become worthless overnight, and it had continued to matter for the general threat the older aircraft still posed, but it had, in a single night, become insufficient against a specific, upgraded version of a threat he thought he had already solved. A lesson about the impermanence of any tactical advantage in a war fought against an opponent capable of this kind of continuous, deliberate improvement. He remembered training a younger convoy commander months after that night and finding himself repeating a version of the same lesson that had cost him so much to learn firsthand. He told the younger man never to assume a threat he had solved once would stay solved. He described the layered engine sound, the difference between the aircraft he had learned to survive and the one that had replaced it without warning, and watched the younger man absorb a caution that he and himself had only earned the hard way in the field, with the convoy at risk, and he came eventually to a complicated respect for the process that had produced the aircraft above his convoy that night, separate from the fear it had once caused him. It represented not a single brilliant insight, but years of patient incremental engineering, solving one identified weakness after another in a design that had already proven its basic concept sound. He had spent that night afraid of a machine. In the years afterward, he came to understand that he had really been afraid of a process, a system capable of noticing exactly what was not working and building, deliberately and methodically, whatever came next. Here is what he finally understood about the aircraft that replaced the one he had already learned to survive, and why the change in its engine sound mattered more than any single night's danger. The original gunship had been a brilliant idea, built on an aging, undersized airframe that could never fully deliver everything the idea actually promised. Its successor was not a different idea. It was the same idea, built correctly, with every identified weakness deliberately engineered away, more engines for survivability and power, more weapons for sustained lethality, a specialized variant purpose-built to solve the exact problem convoy commanders like Hyan represented. Nothing about this progression required any dramatic new insight. It required only the patient, methodical willingness to look honestly at what the first version had gotten wrong, and to fix it deliberately, one identified problem at a time. That is the real meaning behind the change sound Hyan heard that night, and it reaches well past one aircraft and one convoy. An opponent capable of this kind of continuous, honest self-assessment and the industrial capacity to act on it repeatedly does not simply defeat you once and stop. It keeps returning, each time with the specific weaknesses you learned to exploit in its earlier attempts already identified and corrected, forcing you to relearn the terms of the contest again and again for as long as the war continues, and the resources to keep improving remain available. Ian heard a familiar engine note that night, and beneath it, something new, and he understood correctly that the rules he had learned at real costs over the previous year no longer fully applied. The aircraft above him was not simply Puff grown larger. It was Puff's every weakness, identified and solved, flying the same mission with none of the limitations that had once given men like Hyan room to adapt and survive. That is what made Puff's successor even more feared than the aircraft it replaced. Not because it was something entirely new, because it was everything the old threat had already taught them to fear, with every escape route they had found already closed. Now you know why the sound alone was enough to make Hyan move his convoy before he understood anything else about what was circling above him. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. These are the histories worth keeping, not just the famous battles with their famous names, but the quiet, continuous process of improvement that shaped an entire war in the skies above it on both sides of that long conflict. If it meant something to you, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters, and it helps these videos find the people who care about them. If you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time. Hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss a new one. I would love to know where you are watching from today, and if someone in your family served in Vietnam, a gunship crewman, a truck driver on the trail, anyone in any unit, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men carried a story like the one you just heard. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.